And Ms. Show, as I said, I'm also streaming to YouTube so that way members of our firm can jump in and um, ask questions as well.
Awesome.
Just
Will
trying to,
I see the questions or will you just read it out loud?
I
Out
was just
loud.
planning on reading it out loud, if that's okay
Okay.
with you.
Cool. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Welcome to the Hybrid Attorney Podcast. We are your hosts, Austin Marler and Devin Thorpe. I am Devin Thorpe.
And I am Austin Marler.
There we go. And today we are joined by our first ever guest on the podcast, Miss Gina Cho, who we are so thrilled to have here with us. Miss Cho is a former bankruptcy attorney, mindfulness instructor, executive coach, and she is the co-author of the best-selling book. I've got a copy right here. See if I can get it to focus. The Anxious Lawyer, an 8-week guide to a joyful and satisfying law practice through mindfulness and meditation, which was published by the ABA back in 2016, co-written as well by Miss Karen Gifford. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. But thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Show, to talk a little bit today about, the abstract topic of mindfulness and meditation, and hopefully spread awareness of it so that way professionals, not only in the legal field, but in other fields as well, can use the information that we talk about today and hopefully put it to use in their personal and professional lives. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I first and foremost wanted to give a little bit of context to why I think this is such an important topic of discussion in our field by sharing a couple statistics. So I went through, and I want to get some of your thoughts on this, Gina. I went through a couple different studies, some that were done by the American Bar Association themselves, and then others were done by universities. There was a 2016 ABA study that was done through the Betty Ford Foundation that found 28% of lawyers showed signs of depression and 21% struggled with problematic drinking. A subsequent 2020 study found that roughly half of practicing attorneys reported depression or anxiety symptoms, about 30% mild and 20% moderate to severe, as well as lawyers felt as though, or lawyer depression rates roughly were 3 times higher than that of the general U.S. population. You want to talk about anxiety as well? It's now a lawyer poll through American Lawyer found that 70% of attorneys reported increased anxiety and about 37% reported depression, um, with women and younger attorneys reporting worse outcomes, in those cases 2 to 4 times more likely to report moderate to high stress. So I think that kind of paints a picture of the legal landscape in terms of mental health. I'd be curious to get any input that you have on some of those findings.
Yeah. So, I'll just begin by saying I am part of that statistics. I started practicing mindfulness and meditation because I was eventually diagnosed with social anxiety disorder. So I think, actually, right, like when we kind of look at the numbers, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, really a lot of lawyers are suffering. But also, when you're part of that statistics or when you know somebody who's part of that statistics, I think it kind of paints a fuller picture of what's going on, right? So I think it's important to think about why do we even care about these numbers? Like, why does it matter, right? Like that so many lawyers are struggling with some type of mental health issue, and it's because it directly affects your ability to be a competent lawyer, right? So I think it's sort of important to kind of set that as a foundation because sometimes I'll sort of get feedback or pushback from lawyers, and that says like, well, why do we even care? That so many lawyers are struggling with mental health issues, and it's because it directly impacts your ability to be very competent. Um, and I'm so glad that there is more conversations around the mental health issues that so many lawyers are struggling with. What I'm not seeing a whole lot of is really like an in-depth conversation about, well, the why, right? Like, why is it that lawyers struggle with such a higher rate of mental health issues than the general population? And what can we do to try to transform or change our profession, right? So that it's not so, I don't know, I'd say taxing, but I don't know. It doesn't really seem like we're having a whole lot of conversations around, what does the alternative look like?
It reminds me of that. It's not a parable, but like that story of this person found this person went to the river and found um, babies, like swaddled babies, floating down the river, and so immediately, they started trying to rescue all of the babies out of the water, and so one would come along and they would take it and find someone to take it in, and at one point there was so many floating down the river that they had to recruit help from the local village to um, be removing these children from the water and finding homes for them until someone else came along and said, well, why don't we go downstream and figure out who's putting these children in the water and just go ahead and cure the issue. Like we're obviously, you're correct, I think, to say like there are plenty of conversations going around about how to like do immediately try to treat it, but not delve into what's causing it in the first place and why there are such disproportionate rates of anxiety and depression in this field in particular.
Going into those numbers, Devin, it actually made me think of a question that I kind of want to ask both of you and get your thoughts on. Do you think the anxiety and kind of the mental health that comes along with being an attorney is from what we do in our daily lives, or is it kind of more of a character trait or a personality trait of the people that want to pursue this profession and it just kind of carries through? So I don't have an
Yeah,
answer for it. I just didn't know
and
what either
that
of you guys
is kind
thought.
of an interesting question, right? Like, are people who are more prone to mental health issues are drawn into the profession? Is it like nature versus nurture type of question? What I have seen is when they've done 1L studies, right, students that come into the first year of law school, their mental health picture looks pretty on par with other professional degree, so right, first year medical students, first year MBA students, so on and so forth. And then by the time they're practicing, right, their mental health issues are really spiking through the roof. So, and I think also, right, there is just the fact that I think the legal profession does draw a fair number of, type A personalities who may be just disproportionately prone to anxiety and stress. And, I think there is just sort of like the parts that we can potentially influence or control. I don't think we can really change the fact that, our legal profession is just a very adversarial, typically, right, depending on your practice area. Or there are just, inherent stressors that come along with meeting deadlines and, right, like just sort of the grind of our profession. I think also law firm culture plays a lot, right, into the lawyers experiencing mental health issues. So creating an environment that would just more naturally foster, right, mental health is, I think very important. So, looking at, those relationships, right, between partners and associates and between the associates, like really creating, a healthy work environment where people can talk about their mental health issues and also sort of bring their whole selves into the office. I also experienced it firsthand, but also just hear so many stories about, just working for the nightmare partner or who has like no time management skills and, everything's constantly an emergency. Like those type of stressors, I think we can have some influences over, and that's right. So I think really looking at it from sort of a micro perspective, which is like what type of practices can I personally adapt, right? So that I can stay healthy, but also looking at it, right, as a more macro or structural issue and saying, what can we change about the work firm environment, for example, um, that we may be able to shift. And I think that's one of those places, right? It's really kind of looking at, are there ways that we can just create a more harmonious or just an environment that just works better for everyone. um, and I'm not too sure how many law firms are having those type of conversations.
Yeah, well, I was trying to formulate my answer, and as I came to any suggestion that I could add to the conversation, Gina, who is all wise and all knowing, said everything that I essentially thought or wanted to add. So I don't think I can sum it up better than that. I think it definitely does attract type A uh, individuals, and I think if you were to break it down, certainly a percentage of it would be personality types, like just more, um, I guess, anxiety prone individuals. But I do think that it also has something to do with potentially life outside of the law firm and just how society is set up these days. I think it's easier to slip into anxiety on a general basis these days than it potentially could have been in the past, just with the prevalence of social media and people comparing their career to someone else's career, or where you're at in life at age 30 versus where other people that you went to school with or that you follow on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. Um, there's just more than enough reasons to be anxious if you like kind of don't guard yourself or set up correct boundaries in your personal and professional life. But I think everything else that Gina said was was perfect and summed it up well. That was a good question, though.
Thanks for your affirmation, Devin.
You're welcome, um, Gina. So I wanted to kind of set this up into three parts because you have a really interesting story, in your raising, like in your childhood up until when you decided to go to law school. Um, I know that you're an immigrant from, was it South Korea? Is that okay?
Yes.
Um, and obviously, like, I'm sure that came with its own experience growing up, and so I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of talk about how about your childhood a little bit and how that influenced the person you think you are today, but also why you feel so passionate about spreading awareness on mindfulness and mental health and stuff like that.
Mm, okay. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm an immigrant. So me and my family immigrated from Korea to the US when I was 10. Um, how has it influenced me? Yeah, so I think this is a story that so many immigrant children or immigrant adults can relate to, which is that when we came over, I had to, of course, learn English. But I obviously learned English at a much faster rate than my parents did. So, I really had to take on adult responsibilities as a very young child. I remember being like 12 or 13 years old and like going to my mom to the DMV because, she got this letter from the DMV and she didn't understand what it meant. And so I had to go and like translate for her. And I kind of think back on that. I have a 7-year-old now, and it's just so unthinkable to me, right, to put her in that kind of role. But there I was, and I think it taught me to be just really super independent, super self-reliant. a fixer, right? Like I was sort of responsible for fixing things for my parents. And the other thing is, I think, as immigrants, yeah, we experience a lot of injustices, and I think just people who live, with the experience of marginalization, and, come into contact with the law and how that gets navigated. It was a really eye-opening experience, and I also remember when I was little, I used to love watching Law and Order. Like I probably learned how to speak English watching Law and Order. And so, yeah, it really, I feel like all of those childhood foundations really set me up to want to go to law school. And of course, when I started practicing law, I very quickly realized, like, oh, actually, what we see on TV is nothing like the actual practice of law. But I did become a prosecutor, um, and that was also a really eye-opening experience. The office that I was in, it was fairly homogenous. I think out of 100 attorneys, there were maybe 5, 6 attorneys of color. And I also remember, during arraignment mornings, like just sort of like looking around the courtroom and realizing that I probably have a lot more in common with the people who are sitting on the other side of the bar. Just as far as like, socioeconomic status, or, the chances that they were given in life, or, and I just remember having a lot of those feelings of like, but for the grace of God, like I could be in their shoes. And also I realized just how imperfect and flawed our criminal justice system is. I just kept seeing the same defendant just come around, over and over and over again. And it would be for things like, petty theft, or, public urination, or, because I was a misdemeanor court, right? And I just remember thinking like, oh my gosh, this is so not, what I thought law practice was going to be like. But also, it just felt very out of alignment with the work that I wanted to be doing. So, I did eventually transition over to practicing bankruptcy. But as far as mindfulness goes, my grandmother was a Buddhist, and I remember when I was little, she used to meditate every day, and I would be like, Grandma, like, what are you doing? And she would be like, well, I'm just like, it's clearing my mind, and I'm also sort of giving my life's difficulties over to this higher power. And so when I started really experiencing acute anxiety, I actually fell into this program that had mindfulness as one of the practices of the treatment practice. And it really felt like a full circle moment, because I instantly recognized it as, these like very ancient Buddhist practices that I also saw my grandmother practice, but now it, became like repackaged, right, as mindfulness, and now being taught at universities and schools. And yeah, I really feel like teaching mindfulness is really an extension of the work that I have done as a lawyer, which is really to try to help people, to help alleviate their suffering. You can imagine people who are experiencing, like deep financial distress are obviously very anxious and full of stress. And, I sort of shepherded them through bankruptcy and hopefully got them to a better place at the end of the journey. And I also want to do the similar thing for lawyers. I do feel like there is a way to practice law, right? And like really focusing on those areas that you do have control over, so that you can create a more joyful and satisfying law practice. But actually, I think a lot of us actually are just kind of taught to think, oh, like the law practice is just be miserable, and it should be a grind, and I should be suffering.
Yeah.
I don't know if many of us kind of have joyous and satisfying law practice as their aspiration, right? But that's really what I want to offer, is to really think about like, what type of law practice do you want to have? How do you want it to feel in your day-to-day life, and then intentionally moving toward that goal.
What, just going off of that, do you feel like after doing some searching on that particular question, you've been able to find some semblance of an answer and implement it?
I have, just as far as really looking at the various ways that I was sort of creating my own anxiety or creating sort of my own suffering. And there were just so many different areas, right? So not that, right, my opposing counsel all of a sudden became less difficult, but just, how I relate to that person shifted. I was able
Mm-hmm.
to sort of let go, right, and not do the thing, which I don't know about you guys, I used to do sort of obsessively, which is to, replay conversations in my mind, or, to think about the case, or, and it's also just the mind likes certainty. And when we practice law, there are so many uncertainties, right? So you don't, um, so the mind sort of tries to find answers, or to try to find clarity. Um, and because of that, right there, I think we sort of create our own like suffering, and kind of
Yep.
reducing those, right, where we do have control over. And certainly considering things like, changing your practice area, finding something that is just more in alignment with your, right, your goals, your aspirations, or, who you want to be in life. Um, I also, there's like that saying, like, people don't quit their jobs, they quit their supervisors, or they quit their immediate bosses. And I think there is also just something to be said for if you're just in an environment that is constantly causing you distress, and it's because of a particular, right, like the people that you work with. I think that's a place where you can actually consider, a shift as well.
Yeah, I agree uh, in that sense. I've always said, like, I feel like regardless of where you end up, you'll probably, whether it's in-house counsel, private practice, working for the government, you'll probably feel overworked, underpaid, and overstressed. But what kind of a variable that is in your control, at least, is the people that you're working with, and your work family, and your work-life balance, whether or not that's able to exist. Um, and obviously, I feel like supervisors or managing partners or whoever play a big role in that, because they kind of not only set the example, but set the set the policy for younger associates all the way through, to follow. So, and I do want to just, Austin, is everything fine on your end? Because Gina's been frozen on my screen, but she is. I can see her on the live stream at least.
Yeah, she's fine on my screen.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure.
And a lot of what you guys are talking about, it reminds me, our firm, our managing partner, on one of our weekly meetings would frequently bring up from a book talking about a topic of a zone of genius. And a lot of what you're saying right now kind of reminds me of that, and finding a way to be happy, or doing what you think, doing something that makes the time go by quicker and you enjoy it, is kind of a synonym that I keep referring back to based off kind of what you're describing.
Yeah, and I mean, I, Gina, I know that we've discussed this before. I've read The Anxious Lawyer and been, I feel like, consistently implementing meditation and mindfulness into my personal and professional life. Austin is kind of new to it, and so I think that at least kind of gives us a good, two people coming from different perspectives in asking you these questions. But in terms of just like your calling to this particular topic, how would you just, for anyone who's listening to this in the future or currently on the live stream, how would you, I guess, explain your understanding of what mindfulness and meditation are. I just feel like there's such, even for me in my personal life before reading your book and implementing it, it did seem very abstract, and it was something that I had tried, I guess, in earlier life, but it kind of felt, I felt silly or foolish for sitting there and closing my eyes and trying to clear my head of thoughts, or at least that's what I thought I was supposed to be doing at the time. So I'd be interested, and you explain it perfectly in the book, and I'm going to link the book when we post this, but for anyone who's interested. But if you had to just kind of explain it to someone who might not have a deeper understanding of it, that'd be beneficial.
Yeah. So I'll offer two separate definitions, one for mindfulness and one for meditation, because I feel like sometimes we sort of mash them together, but they are related but different. So mindfulness I describe as the quality of paying attention to your moment-to-moment experience without judgment and preference. Um, and that also kind of sounds abstract too. So I want you to sort of imagine or think of a moment, right, where like you really just were sort of like noticing the moment, right? So I'm trying to think of like a recent mindful moment where I was like, oh, this is like in the moment. Like cooking, I think it's a really good example, right? Sometimes you can sort of like cook mindlessly and chop up all of your vegetables and sort of throw everything into the pot, add the appropriate seasoning, and then sort of serve the meal, right? Or you can do it with a sense of mindfulness, which is where you but just pay closer attention to what is happening. So, as you're chopping the vegetables, you might actually look at the vegetables and consider for a moment, this crazy journey, right, that the zucchini took to get onto your cutting board. Um, or, like when you're tasting your food, really like, taking the moment to savor and taste it and, considering like, does it need more salt? Does it need more basil? Or, whatever it is. So this practice of just really noticing the moment. Another example might be when I'm in the courtroom and, it's one of those docket days, right? So you're just waiting for your case to be called and, there's 14 cases ahead of you. And in that moment, you might just notice, like, oh, I'm noticing that my heart's beating a little bit faster and my hands are feeling a little bit clammy. Or my mind feels really busy, thinking about my case. So, like, it's just really noticing what is happening in the moment. And then there's meditation, which is the formal practice of mindfulness. So the meditation is what Devin you sort of described, or probably what most people think about, sitting down cross-legged with your eyes closed and trying to clear your thoughts. But meditation does not have to be done sitting in on the ground cross-legged. You can meditate sitting in your chair. You can meditate while you're walking. But it is this formal practice. It's a formal practice period of mindfulness. So when you're meditating, you're not actually trying to clear your thought. You're just observing what is happening in the moment. And typically you close your eyes and you sit still because you're actually trying to reduce sort of the stimulus, right, that you get from having your eyes open, or when you're moving about, there's just more stimulus that your body comes across. So you're just sitting sort of in a quiet space with your eyes closed, and then you choose an object of attention. So a typical sort of starter object of attention would be the breath. So you would sit and just breathe, right? You would just notice, okay, my body is breathing in, and my body's breathing out. And they just continue. And then very soon, right, your mind just starts doing crazy things. It, starts to have all sorts of thoughts. You start to have imaginary conversations. You start to notice, that achy shoulder pain that you've been ignoring, or your lower back pain, or you feel like your hips are on fire, right? There are just so many things that come up. And your job is to simply observe it, with mindfulness. So just noticing what is happening at the moment. and then letting go of that judgment, right? Which is just so, I feel like that's, as lawyers, that's literally what we're trained to do, and kind of what we're paid to do is to practice and use our judgment. But just noticing like, oh, I'm thinking about this case, and the meet and confer that I had with the opposing counsel, and how dare he say that thing, or oh, my client is an idiot, or just whatever the mind is doing, and you go, wow, like I'm sitting here meditating, and I'm giving a lot of mental and cognitive oxygen to my case that I can't bill for, right? Because
Hmm.
you're sitting on your meditation cushion. And you just notice that, and then when you notice that, you gently bring your mind back, to the breath, and you go, okay, I'm breathing in. Yeah, that's the practice.
Well, yeah, and it's meditation, the act of it. Well, I'll start off by saying this. So I meditate, or I try to every morning um, before starting work, and that's honestly normally when I'm most anxious is before I crack open my laptop and am swarmed with all these emails that I've accrued in the last 12 hours since clocking out the day before, all of the tasks that I have that are overdue, and the font changes to red because it gets my attention that they're overdue, and so that's a battle that I feel like I deal with on a daily basis. Is the mind can just be so conniving in terms of thinking. It's easy to think about the worst case scenario, even if it's not real or it's making it up. And so when I meditate most mornings, that is exactly where my mind's going, is everything you just said, floating to cases or being mean to myself, whether or not that's justified. But I do want to say something that you said earlier on when you were talking about mindfulness in particular, is that's the biggest uh, benefit or difference I've noticed in my life since meditating regularly. Is I am constantly and consistently most days having moments where like I have a thought, and I'm now that I practice mindfulness, it's so much easier to spot that as a thought, step back from it, and ask myself why that thought is there, or like just know that that thought is not my identity. I almost never uh, had that happen prior to implementing meditation,
Mm.
and it's wonderful. Like I'll be on a dog walk, and I do a lot of them without headphones now. I used to do my dog walks with headphones, either listening to podcasts or music or whatever. And I'll be, now that it's getting hot out in North Carolina, is where we live, I'll be sweating and mosquitoes will be coming down and biting me. And I'll kind of just want the walk to be over or whatever. And I've consistently had these moments where I just stop on the side of the road with my dog because I spot that I'm having all these negative thoughts or these negative frequencies creeping in, and I never used to do this, but I'll take a deep breath and I'll just stand there for a second. I'll pet my dog, like kind of savor the moment, realize, what I'm grateful for, or, that I'm grateful for my health or whatever. And that's just not something that I used to do in my day to day life that the practice of mindfulness has helped with. I think that kind of hopefully illustrates what you're talking about, especially when you're talking about cooking. It's just another example, at least.
Yeah, I love that story of just being like noticing, and that's such a empowering experience when you can go, oh, that thought, right, that says like I'm not a good lawyer, or oh, I failed at this, or right, like those thoughts are not me. They're also not mine. It's like, oh, and so often those thoughts aren't even like yours. Like I often notice those thoughts came from some external source, and somehow I, adopted it. And that's such a, yeah, and I think that's really where, right, you can play a more active role in reducing your own stress and anxiety and being more depression prone. It's because you're literally shifting. And this isn't about like glossing things over, right? Like you're not standing there going, oh, and everything is perfect, right?
Hmm.
But you are able to just sort of notice the moment and go, oh, yeah, like in this moment, I have so much to be grateful for. My therapist calls them glimmer moments, and I really love that term. So so these glimmer moments are like, when you have like those really dreary, like gray days, right? And it's just kind of like, gray. And it, and then like for just a little bit, the clouds open up, the sun shines through, and like everything feels bright again. And it might last 10 minutes. Which is not to say the rest of the day didn't suck, right? And I think as lawyers, we have so many of those days, right? It's just like the day was just a grind, right? Like the deposition went 4 hours over, the translator didn't show up, right? Like whatever. But to be able to just pause in those moments and go, oh yeah, but in this moment, right, I can savor my cup of coffee or, eat my lunch with a mindfulness, or even just like washing your hands. That's one of my favorite moment to practice mindfulness, and just taking in the extra second to feel the temperature of the water in my hand, or even just like adjusting the temperature so that it's to my liking, instead of just shoving my hands in there at whatever temperature it ends up being and rushing through my day. So yeah, just finding those little moments where you can just sort of take a breath and reconnect with yourself and just notice your nervous system and sort of regulating yourself.
It's like this is a skill I struggle with a ton. I'm very much someone that when I'm in the car, I'll have it be completely silent. And I feel like I'll begin to try to practice your definition of mindfulness, and I'll acknowledge all of these things that I am feeling or thinking about. But I don't just accept them at that. I'm very much thinking, oh, I'm thinking this, and I try to solve whatever problem I'm thinking of, or it leads me down an even deeper train of thought of, oh, I have to do this, 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 rather than just acknowledging it in the moment. And it just adds even more anxiety in those at that time. So figuring out a way to cut that line off probably would be beneficial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that. So I didn't want to cut you off, Gina, if you had anything to comment on that.
Yeah, I think just what you're even observing, right? Like really we can't make any shifts in our lives without awareness. So it sounds like you have some level of awareness of what is happening. So you can set an intention, right? You can set an intention to say, whenever I'm noticing that my mind is, and I think it's also helpful if you can kind of define those thoughts, right? So a lot of my thoughts would be something around, I call them like unproductive, unhelpful thoughts. So many thoughts, like they may be factually true, right? Like, maybe one thought might be like, oh my God, I'm going to go lose that hearing. And then, and then all the things that's going to happen because of the fact that I lost a hearing. And there's nothing sort of inaccurate about that thought, right? Like it could happen, right? And we can do everything we can to prepare against it. But that thought is like unhelpful and it's unproductive. So just being able to label it and go, oh yeah, no, that thought, I know you, right? You're unhelpful and you're unproductive, and I'm gonna just let it. And then having some practice around like, what are you gonna do to sort of redirect your attention, right? Because we don't want to stay there and sort of engage with that thought. We want to actually sort of redirect, right? It's kind of like training a puppy. So it's helpful if you can have a practice where it's like you're going to redirect. So like Devin mentioned, just being, taking a breath, right? And noticing, oh yeah, my mind is really, that thought is very juicy right now, right? Like, and I want to keep tangling with it, but just recognizing like, it's not going to get me to a helpful place, right? So you can actually ask yourself, like, is this repetitive thought that I'm having, is it helpful? And I'm going to guess majority of the time it's not helpful, right? So if the answer is it's not helpful, then the practice is to bring awareness to it and go, oh yeah, I'm recognizing that I'm doing it. I think a lot of times the other thing that we tend to do is add negative judgment to it, right? So it's like, oh, I'm having that thought again. I'm giving that person, airtime in my head, or there's some like additional negative self-criticism that comes with it, which obviously doesn't help either, right? Because now you're engaged with sort of an adjacent as unhelpful and unproductive thought. So sort of returning yourself. Or you can do have other cues to sort of redirect your attention, right? So you might like just have a practice like you're gonna clench your fists, or get a sip of water, sort of like whatever little thing you can do to sort of move your attention away from that thought that your mind is obsessing over.
And it's also I we talked about this earlier, but I don't understand. I'm sure there's an evolutionary explanation for it, but it really is so easy to have negative. Like it's easier in my mind to have negative thoughts than positive ones, and that goes back to your whole. You kind of have to train yourself. There's that statistic, or not statistic, but I guess scientific finding that it takes more muscles to frown than to smile, or it engages more muscles in your cheeks or whatever. I don't know how true that is, but I always heard that growing up. But I feel like that's certainly the case for our internal monologue. It's so much easier to be downtrodden on yourself, to beat yourself up over scenarios that sometimes, or a lot of the times, are not even in your control, and you're just, being relentless with yourself and spiraling over stuff outside of your control. And anything I feel like that you can do to train yourself not to entertain those thoughts. I mean, they'll still come, but I think mindfulness is the best way to spot them, label them, and kind of move them off to the side if there's nothing you can do about them. But I do understand your frustration, Austin, because we do, I think, in our field, our gut instinct is when we experience a problem, okay, well, there must be some sort of solution, so let me think for the next 5 minutes about what that solution is and what I can do to implement it. And but sometimes it's as easy as saying, okay, yes, that's a problem, but like, I'm not going to let that impact me or ruin the rest of my day.
A couple of things that's coming to me. One is the negativity bias. Like humans just have a bias toward negative information, which is why the news is full of them. And we pay closer attention to negative information than we do positive information. So it's like, like in couples therapy, or I think this is true in any interpersonal relationship. I can't remember exactly what the ratio is. It's like you need 7, I'm going to make up a number, right? You need like 4 positive interaction to overcome 1 negative interaction. It may even be higher, right? I don't know exactly what the proportion is. So like if you're going to deliver, let's say like a negative, I don't know, we call it like negative criticism towards somebody, like you want to sandwich it between the positive, so it's like they're all of these things. So, I think just sort of recognizing that we do as humans have a bias toward negative information. So like intentionally shifting your brain away from that, is really helpful.
Okay, I couldn't agree more. While we're kind of on, now that we've moved on to the topic of, we've already talked about mindfulness and meditation. You start the book off with a distinction, though, between 3 different practices: mindfulness, metta, and mantra. And not only did I like the alliteration of those 3, all starting with M, but I did find like all 3 of those being helpful, and I kind of had my own journey trying each of the 3 out to see which one resonated with me most. But I know that those are going to be those words aren't going to have any meaning to people watching. So if you could just briefly touch on, we already did mindfulness, but in your own words, like how would you describe what metta is in mantra in terms of implementing that into your practice?
Yeah, so there are different types of meditation, let's say. So, first one we already talked about, which is the mindful meditation. Sometimes it's just called insight meditation, where you simply focus your attention on the in and out breath in your body. And then the second meditation is metta, which is where you practice offering yourself and others compassion. And that's a really beautiful practice, especially if you're experiencing a lot of heartache or a lot of difficulties. I've certainly had my own journey with metta. Like I really had a hard time relating to it. And I think it's because compassion is just something that doesn't, feel very natural to me. It actually, at times felt quite scary, in fact. And so that's been a really interesting journey, and it's a continuing journey. Um, and and the last one is the mantra meditation, which is where you repeat a word or phrase sort of over and over and over again, and it gives your mind something to do during meditation. And that one, I think, can work really well for people who just have a very active and busy mind, and it's like I can't, get my mind to be still during my meditation. So you might choose a phrase like "be here" or breathing in, breathing out, just marking the breath. And then there are these classical mantras. There's one like Soham. Um, so you can try different meditations and see which one works for you. 'Cause, I think it is important to kind of try a few different ones and see. And also, I'd say just because something isn't working for you right now, I wouldn't sort of write it off forever. When I first started practicing meditation, I really resisted against doing metta practice. And if that's the case for you, like you don't have to force yourself. You don't, this isn't like punishment, like really finding a practice that feels easeful, something that you can enjoy. Um, because this is like a really special and sacred time that you're carving out of your day to be with yourself, right? And that's also, I think, a challenge for so many of us. It's so easy now to be distracted constantly, and so we don't have to sort of think about or feel things. And this is a moment where it's like, yeah, like I'm gonna just be with what is actually happening in the moment, and that can be quite uncomfortable at times. It can also be very liberating and joyful as well. um, but yeah, because so often I think we avoid our emotions. I think if you kind of look at the thoughts that your mind tends to get really, really stuck on, there's usually some type of an emotion accompanying, and probably multiples of them. Um, because that's right, that's actually something that the mind is drawn to. It's like these problems or issues that you want to solve, but typically there's some type of an emotion underneath it. So if you can actually figure out what that is, um, that's, that will give you more insight and then help you figure out a way to let it go as well. So anyway, I digressed a little bit there, but
No,
hopefully
no, no, that was great. Austin, since you're kind of learning on the fly, was there any questions that came up in your
A
mind?
question, not as much, but an observation. Whenever you were talking about that, sometimes we will try to avoid those emotions to try and ignore them. I feel like that's definitely something that I do. Like even yesterday, I was like, I'm trying to avoid a certain emotion of, I guess it was a general anxiety of this upcoming week. And I was like, so I'm going to try and read to distract myself from it. And I find myself not being able to really enjoy the act that I'm trying to use to distract myself as much as I otherwise would if I would have taken the time to really sit down and address whatever the emotion was that I was feeling, and then going on and doing that task rather than using it as a distraction, because it seems to kind of just harm each other in that way. And I also feel like we have a question in the chat that kind of goes right to this. Devin,
Was it Sydney's or Sabrina's?
Sydney's, I believe.
Oh, okay. Gina, we have the privilege of having, we've got summer interns now that have joined our firm for the next 2 months, and so a couple of them are tuned in. So there'll be a couple specific questions in terms of current law school students. Sydney Buck asked, what practices would you recommend for law students to establish now while still in law school?
I think sitting and meditating every day, even if it's just a minute or two. And also, really thinking about almost like writing your own well-being plan, right? Which is not to say that it's this like inflexible document, but thinking about what are the practices and habits that I either have currently or want to develop so that I can stay healthy, right? So that I can pursue, that joyful and satisfying law practice, or even thinking about like, what do you want your law practice to feel like? I don't think these are questions that I ever really gave thought to as I was starting my, law career. So, I think really thinking about those things, and yeah, and then of course finding good mentors, finding people who can shepherd you and guide you, and also offering yourself grace. Like I think transitioning from law school to your first job, like it's so hard, and I don't think people really acknowledge that it's a completely different system, right? Like you're going from sitting in lectures and taking tests to
Yeah.
managing multiple cases. It's such a big transition, and remembering that it's a long career, right? You're going to hopefully do this for many, many decades to come. So really establishing those healthy practices early on.
So that kind of brings me back to a note that I made early on in this podcast. So the word practice has been coming up a lot so far, and it seems like in law school we're kind of taught the law and the skills that we need to practice the law. But this is an area that seems to kind of be glossed over and ignored. Like I know when Devin and I were in law school, I don't remember ever having these skills addressed whatsoever. We're pointed to a lot of resources that we can go to and reach out to if we need, but we're taught how to do legal research, how to do legal writing, and whatever else, but we're not really taught this emotional aspect inside, and that we have to learn in that transition from law school to here. Like I remember when Devin and I did a networking event with law school students, a question that came up almost every single group that kind of walked up to our table when they learned we did family law was, how do you handle the emotional side of that? And at the time, I didn't have an answer to that because it's something I was still trying to address and work my way through at the time and still am. So just the talk of practice, it's something that if I was taught this earlier in law school, I feel like I would have a better grasp on than I do currently.
Yeah, right. Like, and not only are we not really equipped to or offer tools for handling the emotional cost, right, to the practice area that we're in, but I just feel like so many things, like, giving and receiving feedback, collaborating with other people on your team, or how to find mentors in your office, or like how to ask for help, when to ask for help. There's just so many skills that we're not, how to have conflict with somebody in your office, how to have conflict with your opposing counsel. how to handle something when somebody insults you. There's just so many things about law practice that we're not taught. So yeah, I think just really offering yourself some grace, and also, I think it's also really important to have a life outside of the office. Like having hobby, having really healthy, solid social network, right? Because it's so easy to allow your work to become your complete identity. It's like there's no separation between you and who you are as a lawyer. And I think that can be quite dangerous. So, having that sense of separation, having outside interests, probably learning how to draw boundaries is another one that it's also probably a lifelong skill that we're learning as well.
Yeah. And I feel like, at least from my experience, the word practice, Austin, it really is more similar than you would think, because when you think of practicing law, I feel like it's phrased that way because you're never going to master law. You're never going to know all the answers to every legal issue that you encounter, and so it's an ongoing practice, whether you've been doing it a year or doing it for 50 years. And it feels the same way with mindfulness. I mean, I don't think you're ever going to master your brain and these thoughts. So it is an ongoing conversation and like intentional thing that you have to submit to. That is helpful, but like it's not something that you should go into it with ego and thinking, yeah, I'm gonna master this. I'm gonna master my mind and like not need to do this one day because the anxiety will cure itself or whatever. Gina, I'd be curious to know, we do have a question from someone who the question's related to kind of scheduling, like how to schedule and be intentional about this. But before we get to it, I'd be curious to know what your current routine is in your personal life, so that way you're able to prioritize, even if it's just meditating once in a day or whatever, because I'm sure that you have a very busy schedule. And so how do you prioritize that on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I use an app called Insight Timer. The app has, I feel like, gotten overwhelming, but I only use it as a timekeeper. So for me, not breaking the streak sort of helps me to be accountable. So, I try to sit every day for just a few minutes, and it really sort of depends on the day as far as like how long I sit for. And if I don't or can't do it in the morning, then I'll do it in the evening. So my daughter and I, we have this evening practice where we'll sit at an altar, and she'll light the candles, we'll light an incense, and we just sit for a minute or two. And then that would be my meditation practice. What I do daily, though, is to spend as much time as I can in nature. So that can be doing yard work, or I live very close to the American River here, so going for a walk on the trail. Or we've become backyard chicken people over the pandemic. So tending to the chickens. And I feel like that, just like actually getting my hands on the earth and working just outside is such a grounding experience. And I can literally just feel like the stress and anxiety melting away through my hands as I'm weeding and gardening and planting and sort of doing all of that. So that, I think, has become closer to my daily meditation practice, actually, is connecting with nature on a daily basis. And yeah, and we try to go camping as much as we can and just spend as much time outdoors as we possibly can.
Okay. Austin, going off of that, do you want to read Sabrina's question that is related to that?
So Sabrina asks, with the unpredictability and lack of control lawyers often have over their daily schedules, what advice do you have for lawyers who want to schedule regular therapy, meditation, or wellness appointments?
Yeah. Um, and then I think there's like sort of the part where it's like you, right, like your life is just very busy, and it's hard to schedule those things. And then also, are you in an environment that is conducive, right, to you taking time for therapy and, all of those things. So hopefully you're already in an environment that would be supportive of you putting therapy on your work calendar, for an hour each week, and no one's gonna call you out for that, or it should be encouraged, right? Um, and I mean, I think sort of the short, easy answer is you make it a priority, right? So things like therapy, right? Just like you would tend to any physical ailment, I think attending to your mental health is just as important. As far as like meditating every day, for a very, very long time, I just had a standing rule, and it really worked for me. Is no meditation, no coffee. It's like my day doesn't really quite start until I've had my cup of coffee. So, I think that's helpful, or anchoring it to a habit that you already have, right? So, even presumably, even on your busiest day, you're brushing your teeth. So, it's like before you brush your teeth, I'm going to just sit for a minute or two. And I think that should really be your goal, is just a minute or two. And all the research is very, very consistent on this, right? It's the consistency of the practice that makes a difference, more so than the duration of any single practice session. So it's better to meditate, let's say, for 1 minute a day for a whole month than it is to meditate once a month for 30 minutes. You're meditating for the same amount of time, but it's the consistency of the practice. And sort of noticing, like, or if you're not meditating, you might just notice, like, what's getting in the way, right? Is it my perfectionist tendencies creeping in, right? Oh, if I can't do my 10 minutes, or oh, I haven't done it for 4 days, I'm already failing at this, so why bother? Or, right? So really noticing those stumbling blocks. It's also really helpful, if you can, to meditate with other people. So you might see, other places locally where you can go and sit and practice together. Like, I found going on retreats, meditation retreats, to be just so helpful for really boosting my home practice and making it a habit.
What I'd be curious to know, how that experience has been for you, because I think that's something that I'd want to entertain in the future. But again, the thought of meditating in the open with others is something that would create anxiety in me, and so I'd just be curious to know. I mean, I know that you kind of stumbled into this journey by, I guess, going through the program that you mentioned earlier, but how has your experience with retreats been?
Initially, like, I really get that feeling of like, yeah, it's a little weird. Like, other people are also meditating with me. Um, yeah, but once I started going, like, I really loved the community aspect of it, and meeting other like-minded meditators. I think you can tell, people who've just been meditating for a long time. There's just like a sturdiness to them, and like a calmness, and I found it very inspirational. So yeah, I think, like, really kind of bringing curiosity to that hesitation, or that resistance, or the anxiety around it, like becoming curious, what's behind it, what are the thoughts that are associated with that. Um, and then also kind of looking at, like, but it sounds like part of you is kind of curious about it. So looking at that aspect of it, it's like, well, like, what are some of the things that I may be able to get out of it? And you can also just go to like a local sitting group where you're only sitting for like 10, 15 minutes. Like, this is not obviously the same thing, but like, have you gone to yoga, where you're practicing with other people, and then at the
Yeah.
end, hopefully there's some meditation or probably
Hmm.
a 30-second shavasana at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. And
The best part
some
of
of
yoga.
that, yeah, honestly, I mean, nothing, there is no greater meditation for me personally than doing 50 minutes of hot yoga and then laying on my back with a cool towel, a cool towel on my forehead, and just meditating. But I do get what you're saying. I think it is for me for some reason just a weird perspective thing because I've gotten involved in my community. In terms of I go to run club now, and I don't think anything of it showing up to this group of people and running, a 5K every single week. Like that's just normal to me because I've been running for so long, and so I think with continued consistency, I might be able to shift the perspective of like, yeah, it's normal. It's exciting to go show up with people, like-minded people, and participate in this together.
Yeah, and it's probably a lot easier to go for whatever the distance is, right? When you're running with other people than it is to go solo. Like, I've done multi-day like silent meditation retreats. And there's just no way if I was by myself, I wouldn't be able to meditate by myself for 14 hours a day for 3 days in a row. But when you're with other people, there's like strength that you get from that. And it's like, okay, they're
Yeah.
doing it. I can also get through it.
So, listening to the two of you talk about meditation, to me, it's almost seeming like analogous to a preventative practice, like with injury prevention of going to physical therapy to prevent yourself from being injured later on. It seems like if you establish this consistency with the meditation, that maybe it's a preventative practice of some of the mental concerns that could go down the line. Because when I first started this conversation, it almost seemed like more of a reactionary tactic or like practice of whenever I feel those feelings, then I should try to meditate rather than. But after hearing you guys talk for like for the last 10-15 minutes, it seems better if it's more of a consistent preventative way of doing things so it doesn't get like too far down the line towards that mental health concerns. And I don't know if that's a fair way to think about it, but that's just kind of what I'm getting from the conversation the two of you just had.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely having a daily consistent practice will help you. I think to even spot, right? So, like, I know that, I've experienced depression, like clinical, depression in the past. And now because I have a daily practice, it's like I'm sort of checking my own internal mental health. It's like thermometer, right? And if I start to notice like, oh, I'm sort of noticing like there's this sadness or this sort of disengagement or, this feeling of heaviness and it's like showing up like day after day after day, I sort of know like, oh, like that could be a sign that I'm slipping into, let's say the depressive zone, so that I'm able to, do whatever it is, sort of look in my chest of toolbox and say, okay, like now I have a bunch of tools that I know I can rely on if I'm sort of noticing that or even just like bringing it up in therapy and saying like, oh, I'm starting to notice like for the last 2 weeks or so, like I'm just kind of feeling crummy and there's no specific reason for it. I'm just kind of feeling crummy and it's like, okay, like let's talk about it. And, and usually I can sort of steer course correct little bit sooner than if I'm sort of living unaware, right? And then it's like, bam, like depression just hits you like a truck, and it's like, where did that come from? It's because I haven't been paying attention. Yeah.
Well, in going off of that, I think you're right in the way you're thinking about Austin. Um, Something that I'd be curious to talk about, Gina, is I think it's good with dealing with anxiety and depression, but the book does talk about like other benefits it has, and so like there's obviously all these different studies that talk about it being able to improve focus, creativity. And so I'd love to get your thoughts, Gina, on what those other benefits are and also how you think that they can be applied or useful as tools in whatever profession, whether you're an attorney getting ready for a trial or a doctor or you work retail. I mean, um, I think it can bring something to everyone's professional life, but I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, all of those studies, right? It helps with your cognitive function, helps to improve memory, helps you to be more grounded, increases your emotional intelligence. Like, all of those benefits, of course, right? Like, all contribute to you being a better lawyer. But, like, it's almost like all of those benefits are like a side effect of the meditation practice. Like if you think
Mm-hmm.
about the Buddha, right, like sort of, sitting there meditating, thousands and thousands of years ago, he probably wasn't thinking about like, oh, I'm going to help people alleviate stress when they're working one day. Like the practice is really the practice of, journeying into the self. And also, for me, it's really become this practice to help me get through the many, many difficulties and suffering in life, which of course is also abundant in your law practice as well, right? Whether witnessing the suffering of your clients or the personal suffering that you're experiencing from your practice as a lawyer. Um, so yeah, I almost feel like there is just these like very tangible, concrete benefits to how it impacts your practice, but also there is this like deeper spiritual aspect of the practice that for me at this point is just so much more rewarding. I don't know if rewarding is the right word, is the thing that keeps me tethered to the practice. Does that make sense, right? It's
Yeah.
like I starting to see like, oh, it helps you to contemplate, the meaning of your life, or even just thinking about like how brief, and precious life really is. And I don't think, I really would have considered those, right, of like just the temporary nature of life, like the temporary nature of really everything. Um, yeah, I don't know. Maybe like I'm moving more into like Buddhist psychology or like the philosophy of the practice,
No,
than
I
what
like that.
and in the first place, which is like, yeah, like, I want to be more productive. I want to be less reactive. I don't want to feel so anxious every day. I don't want to look at my calendar feeling like I'm gonna vomit every Sunday evening. Like all of those things kind of drew me to the practice, and it's helped in all of those arenas. And it's also helped me, it's given me so much more. Like I feel like I'm just such a better mom, such a better spouse, better lawyer, because I have this ability to just pause, right? Like, and I think it's like I feel like we can't really overemphasize how important that ability is. It's like not just do knee-jerk reaction and kind of go through life in that state of just having your hair lit on fire and constantly moving 150 miles per hour, but to actually like pause for a moment and say like, well, why? Why am I doing this? Or why am I so frantic? Or, is me continuing to think about this thought the most useful way to spend my time? It helps me to be just a lot more deliberate about how I live my life. So I'm not just sort of living through life trying to meet some external yardstick that somebody else has given me that's really never going to give me that sense of deep satisfaction and meaning in life. And I think that's also like a huge transition from when you are in law school to when you start practicing law. It's like there's no tests anymore, there's
Yeah.
no like you got an A in this thing. Yeah, so I don't know. Does that answer your question? I feel like I kind of went off the
Yeah,
tangent.
no, it definitely did. And I will also say, I mean, I know that we're short on time, but I appreciate your insights I was one of my two majors was religion and philosophy, and um, at a school where it was very much a bigger picture, and so I read the Bhagavad Gita and had courses on Hinduism and Buddhism. So it's more of a personal interest, but I do enjoy the historical context between or behind this, and that also relates to I feel like your grandmother, just by leading by example, was the one who kind of planted this seed earlier on, and it ended up um, being able to come to fruition later on in your life when at a time when you were ready to entertain it and to pursue it. So I think that's interesting. I mean, I want to say it was similarly my Hinduism Buddhism class that planted that seed in my life, as well as my professor was a active meditator, and encouraged us as students to try it, and I did, but that was just at a time in my life when the it felt looking back, the intention probably wasn't there, and the reason behind it, the stress wasn't high enough to feel like I had gotten any benefit from it, but it still planted that seed so that years later, um, when encountering your book, I could take it from a much more serious perspective and do it intentionally. And I think that's kind of what helped me in my own personal journey through mindfulness.
Mm. Yeah, I think so often we're drawn to mindfulness in those moments where there is just a sense of um, suffering, or there's some distress, there's some internal distress, and that's really why this whole practice exists. Is the Buddha, right? His sort of first noble truth is that there is suffering in life, and there is this path out of suffering, and that is through, right, not only mindfulness. There's a whole other set of teachings as well, but that we can learn to relate to the difficulties of life in many, many different ways, right? And we can reduce our own sense of suffering. And I think as I get older and I experience personal losses and suffering, I really relate to that more. And I think that the flip side, right, is also true. It's like if you can really learn to be with, to process, to meaningfully make meaning out of your suffering and move through it, it also allows you to experience joy just on a deeper level. Um, so, another benefit or another side effect of having a
Yeah. One question that I had written down that was kind of just something that I genuinely wanted to know is, obviously this book was published years ago, and you've obviously come a long way since the time that you co-wrote it and put it out. I'd be curious just to know if you've learned, or if you go back in time and add something to it that you've learned throughout your journey over the last decade, what that would be. And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to mindfulness or meditation, but I'm sure that there's been something that you've gained from experience.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, there are many things actually. I think first and foremost, entering into motherhood has just fundamentally changed me. And there's just so much learning that I've gained, just by being a mother, which also has meant that I also had to learn to remother myself, and really looking at those, you know, a lot of like childhood wounds and how it shows up right in my own mothering with my child, but also those early childhood wounds, a lot of which, you know, comes from being displaced and moving to a foreign country and so on and so forth, has always played a role in how I practiced law, right? How I showed up in my life. But it's not until like just this particular moment that, you know, I'm having to confront it with my own daughter, that I'm able to see it. Yeah, so I think that is something that I would probably add something to, right? It's that process of if you, yeah, those, you know, if you have those early wounds from your childhood, as an adult, right, we can actually learn to repair those wounds through the process of remothering or, you know, reparenting yourself. So I think I would definitely write something about that. And the other thing that I would write about, and that feels very relevant in this particular moment, is my own identity as a Korean American, an immigrant, right? Somebody who was not born in this country, who became a citizen of this country through naturalization, and you know, my own perspective around yeah, right, being an immigrant. Like I also grew up with a lot of undocumented immigrants around me, and you know, again, that's one of those situations. Like I just happened to have this good fortune of having the correct documents, which allowed me to live here legally and, you know, to do all the things that I have. Um, and and like, how do I, right, as a Korean American with all of those different identities, which I've always had to navigate, right? Like I've certainly experienced racism, sexism, you know, both overt and subvert. And I didn't give voice to that in the book. Um, and I wished I had, and you know, I think if I ever wrote an iteration of it, I definitely would. That's also been my own personal journey, is to look at that, and to recognize it for what it is, you know, as, you know, racialized trauma. And so I think I would write just more frankly about the different types of trauma that lawyers may experience, you know, which may or may not include, you know, institutional traumas such as experiencing racism and sexism and different iterations of isms in our daily practice as lawyers, which, you know, if you're sort of in the majority, or, you know, if you don't experience those marginalizations that you probably never really have to think about. So I wish that I had given more specific voice to that. But you know, that's also sort of, you can't teach what you don't know. So this is
Yeah.
now something that I do know, and it's something that I would like to give more voice to, and also just feels very, very important to, right, sort of share my own particular perspective with all of my intersecting identities.
I think that was a wonderful answer. Austin, before we start to wrap up, do you have any burning questions just from all that you've listened to today? And then I'll kind of go into my closing questions.
I had a topic of questions kind of going at what you just addressed a little bit, because Devin and I, there's things that you will have experienced that we have not experienced, and so we don't have a lot of different backgrounds for this podcast. So if you could go into even a little bit about that with the little bit of time that we have left, of maybe something that you would have experienced that Devin and I would not have experienced, that other people at our firm or just other female attorneys or anyone in general could learn from perspective that we cannot provide.
Oh, yeah. Well,
So that's a
thank you
super
for that.
broad way of asking it.
Yeah,
It's a-
yeah. I mean, you know, thank you for that curiosity. Yeah, and I think that's right, sort of like the first step to dismantling these structural, you know, barriers, is to bring curiosity. I don't know, you know, like the things that are coming to me to mind is, you know, probably something that I've experienced and neither one of you have experienced, is walking into a courtroom and having the judge ask you if you're the Asian language interpreter. Which actually, that's happened to me more than once. And the first time it happened, I was like, like I remember thinking in my head, and I didn't say it, and I was thinking like, well, Your Honor, which Asian language would you like me to interpret for you today? Because I only know one. It's just like, it's just and I think people who experience marginalization, whether you're black or right, like you're a woman, can all share these type of sort of glaring stories where you're just like, what, Brian Stevenson, who is like my hero, he wrote the book Just Mercy. He talks about the experience of, he's a black man, an attorney, walking into a courtroom and the judge asking, oh, why are you sitting behind the bench? Where's your attorney? And him having to explain, well, Your Honor, I am the attorney, and then having the whole courtroom laugh, and he felt compelled to laugh along, right, as to not prejudice his client. I've had similar experience as well. Maybe another story, another example that may be helpful is I think I always had this sort of, I don't know exactly what to call it, this thing where, 'cause English is not my first language. Like there's always like a part of me that's like, well, I don't quite have like 100% grasp or whatever, and there are times that I stumble or I say I pronounce a word incorrectly, or right, like it's just because it's my second language, like there are those sort of, we call them handicaps, and I think I really had to work through it internally, right? And also to see the fact that I do speak another language, that I have this experience through multiple cultures as really being a benefit, and to really owning it for what it is, and not seeing it as a handicap for myself, first and foremost. But also, I've also experienced other people not being very generous, so like if I like fumble on a word and mispronounce it, like I've had my colleagues like laugh, and I'm like, I don't, I don't think that's really funny. But so I think just having some level of sensitivity, yeah, I'm also like just very grateful to grammar check now, because like grammar has never been my strength again, because it's my second language. It is like just one of those things that I really had to struggle. And now it's sort of like a non-issue probably for any of us. So, I think like those type of, and those are just, just the examples that are coming to mind. But yeah, I think, if you are a person, right, who have privileges, and we all have different intersecting privileges, but, say like, if you're white and male and present as heterosexual, like that has a lot of privileges, and you can learn to exercise those privileges for the people in that room who have less privileges. So, just looking around the room and saying like, who's not in the room, right? Are there people who should be in the room who aren't? And can I be the person who speaks up on their behalf? Or you might literally look at the people sitting at the table and noticing the people who are quiet, right? Or be really becoming very aware of these biases and how it plays out. So one example I can give is, often if you're a woman or a person of color, like your ideas either gets outright stolen or somebody else sort of takes credit for it. And if you notice that, right, to be the person to speak up and say, no, actually, I think Gina came up with that idea, and give credit where it's due. And there are just so many of these type of biases that we all have, right, around gender and race, and just becoming familiar with it, I think is like how we can just help to create a more equitable world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do appreciate that insight. I mean, obviously, like the elephant in the room is we are two. We're both men. We're both Caucasian, and so, but like, obviously, we're a part of the generation who we really want to be a part of the change, of what was like handed down to us in terms of institutionalization. So, like any role that I guess we can play, we try to. and we appreciate that. I mean, especially for whether it's people at our firm or outside listeners who are of color or experience this discrimination or whatever on a day-to-day basis, that's helpful for them. But kind of, I really just have 3 questions not related to mindfulness and meditation in closing that I'd like to get your thoughts on. So you have your own podcast called the Resilient Lawyer Podcast, and I listened to a couple episodes of that in preparing for this, but there's a pretty robust archive that you've built. You've been very consistent with it, and it's done really well. I'd be curious to know what any story that comes to mind or insight that you've gotten from a guest that you've had on there that's stuck around with you in your personal or professional life, kind of just any tidbit of wisdom that you received.
Yeah, I started my podcast because I really wanted to give voice to diverse segment of the legal population, and I think the thing that I really took away, and this is like not exactly answering your question, but the thing that I really took away and learned is just how many different ways you can use your law degree. Just there's so many different, and I think I had like a very myopic view of what a lawyer looked like. If I were to sort of ask you, like, imagine a generic lawyer in your head, right? I probably wouldn't pop up as that. And it really made me appreciate the unique things that we can do with our law degree that may or may not fit your traditional stereotype, or yeah.
I agree with that. That's also just not talked about all that much. Oh, did we lose her?
Looks like. Oh, she's back. There we go.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to link all of Gina's stuff. So I'm going to link Gina's podcast. I'm going to link the Anxious Lawyer, the book, and where you can find stuff that she's active on. Austin, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I was going to ask the last question that you normally would ask a client when you're doing direct examination. And if you can't think of it, then I'll say it.
Is there anything else you would like for the court to know today?
Yeah.
So I guess, is there anything else you would like the people listening to know about? The platform is yours right now.
No, you can find me on all the socials. I feel like I should have like a better elevator pitch, but I totally don't. Yeah, feel free to reach out. I love chatting with people about different ways to improve your law practice, or your life, sort of, which is very much related to your law practice. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight. I'll show the cover of the book again. I don't know if it'll focus. There we go. The Anxious Lawyer, which helped me tremendously in my personal and professional life, but I think it could help anyone, whether you're a lawyer or not. So, but we appreciate you coming on and speaking with us. Like I said, we will put all your info in the description of this video so that if people need you, they can find you. But that is all I've got.
All right. Thanks, people, for having me. It's really delightful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today, Gina.